Chapter 19. The Drink of Genius. Coffee has already shown up in this book as a religious aid, a political flashpoint, a smuggled commodity, a chemical compound, and a financial instrument. This chapter looks at something a little more intimate. Coffee as fuel for the creative mind itself. Across the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, an extraordinary number of the era's most celebrated writers and painters didn't just happen to enjoy coffee alongside their work. Many of them insisted it was actively responsible for making that work possible at all. The king of wits and king of coffee drinkers. Few figures in this entire book embodied coffee devotion quite as thoroughly as Voltaire. He was the French philosopher and writer whose wit dominated 18th-century European intellectual life. Voltaire was, by every account, one of the most ardent coffee drinkers among the entire French literary establishment. His consumption reportedly only intensified with age. Even in his old age he was said to drink as many as 50 cups a day. One literary critic went so far as to claim he could trace, portion by portion, exactly which parts of Voltaire's writing had been produced under coffee's direct influence. As though the drink left a visible fingerprint on the prose itself. Whether or not that specific claim holds up to scrutiny, the broader theory it points toward was taken seriously by contemporaries. A professor at Northwestern University's medical school wrote on this exact subject. He argued that coffee could genuinely be considered a substance that fosters genius. It promoted precisely the kind of mental concentration and harmony among the creative faculties needed to produce lasting works of art and literature. History, at least among this particular set of writers, seemed to bear the theory out. Balzac's 12-hour coffee marathons. If Voltaire was coffee's most enthusiastic celebrity endorser, Honoré de Balzac was its most extreme practitioner. For Balzac, coffee wasn't simply a beverage. It functioned, by his own account, as both food and drink simultaneously. It was central to a work routine that sounds almost punishing by any ordinary standard. According to his biographer Frederick Lawton, Balzac's habit was to retire to bed at 6 in the evening. He would sleep until midnight. Then he'd rise to write for nearly 12 consecutive hours. He drank coffee steadily throughout the entire stretch as his primary stimulant. Balzac himself left behind a memorably vivid account of exactly what that coffee felt like doing to his mind. He published it in his own treatise on modern stimulants. He described the sensation almost like a military campaign unfolding inside his own body. Ideas mobilized and advanced the way army battalions might move across a battlefield. Memories arrived at full gallop. Quick comparisons deployed like cavalry. The logical structure of an argument rolled forward like artillery. Flashes of wit darted in like sharpshooters. The entire mental battle resolved itself onto the page in front of him. It's a wonderfully theatrical description. It captures something genuinely important about how seriously writers of this era took coffee's role in their process. Not as a pleasant accompaniment to work, but as something closer to an active collaborator in it. Balzac's own devotion even worked its way into his fiction. In one of his novels, a character named Dr. Minaret is shown personally preparing coffee for his guests in a silver coffee pot. He carefully blends mocha with bourbon and Martinique beans. A small fictional detail that biographers have generally recognized as Balzac simply writing his own personal coffee ritual directly into one of his characters. The perfect cup, according to a diplomat. Not every literary coffee tribute came from a novelist hunched over a manuscript. Prince Talleyrand, the famously sharp-tongued French diplomat, is credited with what may be the single most quoted description of the ideal cup of coffee ever written. Even though the line has occasionally, incorrectly, been attributed to someone else instead. Talleyrand's own summary of coffee at its very best was that it should be black as the devil, hot as hell, pure as an angel, sweet as love. It's a description that has outlived nearly everything else Talleyrand is remembered for. Coffee enthusiasts still quote it more than a century and a half after he first said it. Two drinks, two literary camps. Coffee's rivalry with tea, covered in an earlier chapter, played out among literary figures just as sharply as it did among entire nations. Sir James Mackintosh, the Scottish philosopher and statesman, was such a committed coffee devotee that he genuinely believed a person's mental power could be measured roughly in proportion to how much coffee they drank. His close friend and schoolmate Robert Hall, a well-known Baptist preacher, took precisely the opposite position. He favored tea instead. Sometimes he drank as many as a dozen cups of it in a sitting. The poet Cooper, the Greek scholars Parson and Parr, the formidable Dr. Samuel Johnson, and the critic William Hazlitt all fell into the tea-drinking camp. Robert Burton, Dean Swift, Joseph Addison, Richard Steele, and Leigh Hunt were counted among coffee's most devoted literary champions. It's a small, charming reminder that the coffee versus tea divide covered in an earlier chapter wasn't only a matter of national politics. It played out at the level of individual friendships and rivalries too. Sometimes between people who otherwise agreed on almost everything else. An impatient philosopher. Not every literary tribute to coffee involved grand theories about genius and inspiration. Some of the most charming accounts are simply small human moments. One of the best comes from the writer Thomas de Quincey. He left behind a wonderfully specific account of the great philosopher Immanuel Kant's coffee habits in the final year of his life. By that point elderly and increasingly frail, Kant had developed a fierce daily attachment to his after-dinner cup. He went so far as to write reminders for himself in advance on days when he expected company, simply noting that coffee would be served. De Quincey's account of Kant's impatience once the coffee had actually been ordered is genuinely funny. The household staff would have everything prepared in advance. Coffee ground and water already boiling, ready to combine the instant the old philosopher gave the word. Yet even the brief remaining delay while the coffee finished brewing struck Kant as nearly unbearable. Told the coffee would arrive in a moment, he would grumble that was exactly the problem, since it hadn't arrived yet. He'd compose himself with mock stoicism. He'd declare that he supposed he could die waiting, since at least there would be no coffee, and consequently no waiting for coffee in the next world. And then, the moment he finally heard the servant's footsteps on the stairs, Kant would turn to his dinner guests. He'd call out with genuine childlike delight, "Land, land! My dear friends, I see land." It's a small scene but a telling one. One of the most rigorous, disciplined minds in the entire history of Western philosophy. A man whose work still shapes serious academic debate more than 2 centuries later. Reduced to gleeful impatience by the wait for a cup of coffee. Genius, it turns out, didn't make anyone immune to coffee's pull. If anything, the writers and thinkers in this chapter seem to have felt it more intensely than most. The painters who captured coffee culture. Coffee's influence on the arts wasn't limited to writers describing its effect on their own minds. Painters, engravers, and caricaturists across several centuries turned their attention directly to coffee and the culture growing up around it. In doing so, they left behind some of the richest visual records we have of how ordinary people actually experienced coffeehouse life. The Dutch painter and etcher Adrian van Ostade was a pupil of the great portraitist Frans Hals. He produced what's believed to be the oldest surviving picture of an actual coffeehouse. His 1650 work, titled Dutch Coffee House, captures the young institution at a moment when it still carried some of the rougher characteristics of an ordinary tavern. Coffee is being served to an assembled group in the foreground. William Hogarth, the celebrated English painter and satirical engraver, returned to London's coffee houses repeatedly as settings for his social commentary. His series, 4 Times of the Day, depicts Covent Garden at St. Paul's own clock striking 7:55 in the morning. It shows a prim, elderly woman scandalized by the rowdy young men spilling out of the notoriously disreputable Tom King's coffee house nearby. This was a real establishment. Its proprietor had, according to the historical record behind the painting, fallen from a scholarly background at Eton into a rather more disorderly career running the coffee house that bore his name. In a separate work from his Rake's Progress series, Hogarth set an entire dramatic scene inside White's Chocolate and Coffee House. Jonathan Swift himself once described this club, rather unflatteringly, as a regular meeting ground for con artists and the wealthy fools who lost money to them. Hogarth's scene shows a ruined gambler having lost his entire fortune at the tables, collapsing into a rage on the floor, oblivious even to flames breaking out around him. A visual reference to White's actual real 1733 fire, worked directly into the fictional scene. Elsewhere, the Italian painter Alessandro Lonhi, sometimes called the Venetian Hogarth for his similarly satirical eye, depicted the playwright Carlo Goldoni visiting a café during Venice's declining years as a great power. A beggar approaches Goldoni seeking alms. A small, telling detail about who actually populated these coffeehouse scenes alongside the era's celebrated literary figures. In France, François Boucher, court painter to Louis XV, captured a French breakfast room of 1744 in his painting Petit Déjeuner, now hanging in the Louvre. It's valuable specifically for how clearly it documents coffee's arrival as a genuine household ritual, rather than simply a coffeehouse phenomenon. And in a portrait of Madame de Pompadour, the influential mistress and political advisor to Louis XV, painted by Van Loo, a servant is shown presenting the marquise with a small cup of coffee freshly poured from an ornate covered pot. A fashionable successor, by that point in the century, to the plainer original Arabian and Turkish coffee boilers that had started this entire story centuries earlier. What these works actually preserve. Step back from the individual paintings and writers covered in this chapter, and something genuinely valuable becomes clear. These aren't just charming anecdotes about famous people's beverage preferences. Hogarth's engravings of Tom King's coffee house and the fire at White's are, in a real sense, historical documentation. Visual evidence of exactly how disreputable, chaotic, and socially mixed real coffeehouse life could actually be, captured by an artist who was there to see it firsthand. Van Ostad's 1650 painting is quite possibly our single oldest surviving visual record of what an actual early coffeehouse looked like from the inside. Boucher's Louvre painting shows us, in careful, painterly detail, exactly what coffee equipment and coffee ritual looked like inside a genuine 18th century French household. And Balzac's and Voltaire's testimonies, extreme and theatrical as they sound today, tell us something real about how seriously an entire generation of writers took coffee's role in their own creative process. Not as background detail, but as something they genuinely believed was doing active work inside their minds. Battalion by battalion, cup by cup, page by page. What's coming next? We've now followed coffee from a legendary goat herder's hillside all the way through religious persecution, revolution, colonial empire, chemistry, finance, catastrophe, invention, and now the personal creative rituals of some of history's greatest writers and painters. It's time in this book's final chapter to step back and take in the whole picture. To look at just how completely this single plant, discovered by accident on an Ethiopian hillside, went on to conquer the entire world. Cup by cup, country by country, until it became one of the most consumed beverages on the face of the earth. In our 20th and final chapter we bring the story home.